Hi folks, it's Matt Easton here at Chiswick Auctions. So the Arms and Armour auction coming up on the 29th of May, links below to the catalogue and everything you'd need to know about that. We're going to have a look now at 3 Indian daggers, 3 different types of Indian daggers, and I'm just going to give you a relatively brief look at them, but I thought that you'd appreciate seeing some of these things because I've got them to hand at the moment and they're fairly cool things. So the first thing, the first one I'm going to show is, it's not this one, but you'll all be familiar with the Indian Katar. This particular example is just one of the nicest Katars that I have ever held. My hand fits easily into it. It's nice and big, incredibly thick reinforced point, very deeply chiseled blade, which I believe is probably Wootz at its centre with mono steel edges forge welded on. And of course you'll notice that it has a large amount of Koftgari gold laid onto the surface, essentially hammered onto the surface. But this is just a magnificent thing. But that is a normal Katar. What I'm going to show you now is not a normal Katar. And it is here. Now you will have seen it moving there, so you'll already be able to guess what this is. So these are quite famous. When you squeeze these bars together, this happens. Okay, now these are beloved of museums because they look super cool in cabinets, and indeed beloved of collectors. But what were they really for? Well, the first thing I have to say is the outside blade doesn't really function as a blade, because you've got to bear in mind that this is essentially sheet steel. Okay, so this is sheet steel, a bit like a scabbard that houses the central blade. So these aren't really edges. So you could say this is for trapping things, maybe, and this is the real blade. This is sharp, this is steel in the centre. But if you think about stabbing now, that's actually going to impede your penetration, okay? Because you need to get past these two before you can get to this one. Even if this was slightly longer, even if you penetrated with that first, these are still going to obstruct penetration. So actually, I don't believe that this is particularly for giving some nastier wound. Equally, I don't think that it's meant to go in like that, then open, then come out, or something elaborate like that, like you might find in a movie or anything like this. Quite simply because these outer bits are not really effective or convincing blades. They really only house the blade in the middle there. But it is good quality. It has silver inlay. It's quite dark because it's got patina, you'll see there, but it's got silver inlay up both the, let's make it focus on that rather than my face. There you go. It's got silver inlay all the way up there, and indeed all over the outer surface. So this is an object which someone has gone to an awful lot of effort to make. But were they actually effective weapons? Well, I think probably no. I have never seen one which struck me as an effective weapon, and I think that they were mostly made as gimmicks. Now, I'm actually quite reluctant to write off anything as just a gimmick or for show or whatever. I tend to like to look for practical reasons for something to exist, and you could say that maybe this was used somehow as a bit like a parrying device, a bit like some of the mangoches or left-hand daggers in Europe in the Renaissance, but I don't think so. They're not terribly robust, and I just don't think it would be particularly effective at that. I think this is mostly about showing off, but you have to remember also that these Katars were worn not only as weapons, okay? Most of them never would have been used as a weapon. Mostly they were worn in your sash. You'd wear a tulwar at your side and a Katar in a sheath stuck in the top of your sash, and mostly they were worn as a statement of showing who you were, the fact that you were representing yourself as a warrior, gentleman, nobleman, and this was what you wanted people to think of you as. And having one that was a bit fancy and did a cool thing probably just went further along that path of making a statement. So it was about, you know, not just having a watch that worked, but having a watch that's got a few diamonds in it and does things that you don't need it to ever do. Let's face it, most of us have watches that do things that we don't need them to do, and probably that was similar with these. Now let's have a look at a different Indian dagger for a second. So this is a type of dagger which I've never shown on my channel because I've never owned one, called a Bichwa, and you'll notice that the blade is recurved. Now this is actually quite an old designer blade. In India, when we think of Indian swords, for example, we often think of the curved blade of a talwar. And in actual fact, that style of blade, essentially a shamshir or kilich type of blade, really came in with the Islamic invasions around the 16th, 17th centuries. But actually in India, the native blades of India were usually straight or forwards recurved, a little bit like a giant kukri blade or like a pata or a khandar, these sorts of blades. And in fact, the khandar is a very ancient type of Indian sword. So most Indian swords were actually straight or forward recurved, like a Susan pata, or almost like a yataghan, up until the imported sort of Islamic style saber blades, essentially, that we're more familiar with came in. So this blade, in a sense, harks back to the older period of India, the period of India before the more Islamic styles, the Jambiya came in and the Khanjar, and the Tulwar style blade. So this is quite an old style of blade. It's obviously quite reminiscent of a yataghan, and you'll notice it's got a very unusual hilt, because the blade, instead of following through a grip with a tang or having a full width tang, instead it splits in two different directions, and your hand goes in the middle like this. Okay, now actually the way that these are made is they basically go off in one direction, round in a loop, and then come back and are either forge welded or pinned or riveted through there. So essentially you're taking the tang and bending it around into a loop, or, and that's the way that this one is constructed, the blade is a separate piece. So in this case we have a piece of hard steel making the blade, and then we have essentially a ring of iron that is looped around into two langets, kind of, onto the blade, and they're riveted through here. Now this is actually quite a common construction in general, riveting the blade to the hilt with Indian swords and Indian weapons. So very often we find that with Indian swords, the hilt actually has two langets that rivet either side of the actual blade, and the blade has holes through it. This is true of the khandar, for example. Very often the khandar has a strip of the hilt with long langets going up the blade, and they're riveted through the blade. So quite a different and alien way of constructing compared to most European swords, for example. But this is very characteristic because one side of the loop becomes the handle and the other side is flared out into a sort of guard. And obviously these could be used point down or point up, but because of the curve of the blade, I think it's fair to assume that this was intended primarily to be used point down. And that kind of recurved blade is got a pretty cool shape to it, and also has an increased slicing effect, because you get some of the benefits as it's pushing forward of essentially a curved edge going through the thing that you're stabbing, essentially. And obviously that provides some extra protection on the back of the hand. This particular example has some probably restored gold decoration to it, and it has two little holes there. In fact, it's got more holes down here and up here, so it's got 6 holes here, here and here, that were probably originally for the attachment of a liner, probably a sort of velvet, maybe very lightly padded liner. And we often find that again with Indian weapons. We often find in the hilts they had liners that were lightly padded to make them more comfortable to hold. This is, if you want to read more about it, lot 44 in the upcoming auction. So the final dagger that I want to show you guys is essentially a Khanjar Jambiya style dagger. Okay, so this is the shape of dagger that essentially came into India with the Mughals. Okay, so we're talking about 16th, 17th century. This is essentially an imported style of dagger, but the decoration on it is this is elephant ivory, obviously antique elephant ivory, and the decoration on it is very Indian. But the thing that I really want to focus on is actually the blade, which has some absolutely magnificent koftgari. But moreover, it's a very unusual blade section. So we've actually got the edge is on the inside, okay, a bit like a karambit. So instead of having, normally we're used to seeing an edge on the outside, in this case the primary edge is actually on the inside, and I'm imagining it's intended primarily to be used this way, but who knows, it could have been used that way, or I don't know. The edges, the primary edge is on here. It is probably of Wootz steel. It looks like it's got some degree of pattern in it, but it probably needs etching. And then it's got this koftgari or gold inlay. Essentially they cross hatch on the surface of the steel, and then they hammer gold leaf onto it in patterns and make these beautiful patterns on it. And also it's got this very interesting T-section. So this is almost like it combines the blade design of several different types of dagger. It's got some element of a karambit and some element of a khanjar or jambia. But then it's also got a T-section like we'd find on a pesh kabs or a chura. And then it's got this very raised edge just on the upper half here, which I can't really remember seeing on any dagger. It's quite a unique style, and it reminds me slightly of the yelman on a Turkish kilic. So there we go. We would call this Indo-Persian because I can't say hand on heart 100% that it's Indian. It could be Persian. It could even potentially be Afghan, but we would call it Indo-Persian because it's of a style that takes in elements of those three areas, particularly of Persia and India. But it's a very fine quality weapon and was obviously originally carried by someone of extreme wealth. But this is one of my favourite things in the auction. I think it's an absolutely beautiful and unique dagger, and clearly made with superb degree of skill, both in the blade and in the carving of the hilt as well. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope it's been somewhat interesting. Once again, the catalogue's linked below, and all of the other links to Chiswick auctions. The other thing I would say as well, I'm consigning for the next auction now, so if you've got things that you want to consign to auction, then get in contact with me at Chiswick Auctions. Cheers for watching.